we thought we would start off with just tell us a little bit about like yourself and what you do at WQXR, just like what you do right now. And 'cause I know from experience that WQXR has all these different programs. You know, you have from the top, you have midday masterpieces, live from Carnegie Hall, Berlinville. You have all these amazing different opportunities, and living composers. And so, how in your role, what do you do to pick pieces and programs? And how do you ensure, fairness and diversity, but you also highlight the canon, but then you also cater to the audiences that want to hear the new music and want to hear the different composers and balance that out. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, there's a lot in that question, Tim. um, it doesn't make sense at first blush for an orchestra manager to pivot into radio, but I think the common thread is that I love music, and I love orchestral music in particular. I love new music, and I see WQXR's mission as being to make what we call classical music, which I actually don't love that term, and we can talk about that later. But to make classical music relevant and inspiring and accessible for as many people as possible. So that is kind of what my driving force was working for orchestras, and the same applies at WQXR. I just have a different platform now, and we reach way many more people on the radio than we do giving live concerts. And I'm not saying that it's a substitute. There is nothing that is a substitute for hearing a live performance. And I also feel like WQXR has a role to play in developing audiences and encouraging them to go participate in live performances as well. So that's kind of the big picture of what QXR does and stands for. I think in terms of the diversity issue in programming, it's just everyday work. It's not like you do a project and then you check it off your list. My programming team, which is 3 people, are constantly looking at the playlists and saying, how many composers of color do we have? How many performers of color do we have? How many women composers do we have? And, before QXR really was paying attention to that, I think that it was easy to fall into the canonic way of programming. And, everyone loves, well, maybe not everyone, most people love Beethoven and Mozart and Bach, which happen to be the 3 most popular composers in our classical countdown every year from listeners. But my philosophy about new music and about music from underrepresented communities is like, what does it sound like? So I am realistic enough to know that we are not going to play an awful lot of Elliott Carter on WQXR. It's pretty out there, even for me, and I love a good Elliott Carter string quartet once in a while. It's like, like drinking a shot of, like a shot of ginger elixir or something. But, for listening for a mass audience, that's not what we do. But there's so many contemporary and living composers who write music that people find beautiful now, and that people find accessible. And I don't say accessible as if that's a bad thing, which I think in the music world, like we were taught, oh, well, it's so accessible. It's like, well, that's not supposed to be a good thing. I think it's a good thing because it helps people fall in love with music. And that playing the masterpieces of composers who have both been overlooked and who are writing now, that represent the broad spectrum and the diversity of the city that we work in and the city that supports us, is very important. And that's also about giving voice and authority to people on my team who come from those communities and those populations, and not seeing everything through the lens of a white person or of a non-Black person, and just making sure, like, why do we want diversity? That's a big question. It's like, I think an organization that is just saying, well, we need to have X number of Black staff members, and we need to have X number of Asian board members, and we need to have Y number of Latinx, orchestra members. It's like, those are just checking boxes. If you really think deeply about why do we care about diversity, it's because people come to an endeavor like playing in an orchestra or programming or running a cultural institution with different perspectives and different lenses. And so the diversity is really because you want a healthy perspective that is not blind, without blind spots on the team, to bring everyone's experience and everyone's lens to the table in creating art and in distributing art. So that's what I think about why we want diversity on our airwaves, on our staff, and in our leadership team here at New York Public Radio. And I have to say, the senior leadership team here at New York Public Radio, which has been led for the past year plus by a woman named Goli Sheikh Islami, who is South Asian. She has put together a leadership team that is the most inspiring group of executives that I've ever been a part of, and the most diverse group of people that I've ever been a part of. And having those voices around the table and bringing all the different perspectives is enriching and inspiring.
Yeah, it's always good to see these different cultures and ethnicities being represented in music, and just branching out, and not even just in terms of the composers. You get to see the performers too.
Yeah.
And you get to see diversity in orchestras or other genres such as jazz. That actually brings me to my next question. I was actually just watching last month, the New York Philharmonic had the Lunar New Year concert, and they were talking about how they just started in 2012, which was during your tenure there. And so I was wondering what that process was like, how, you're exposing this larger New York City audience that, even though there's, millions of people in New York City, they might not know about it. So what was the thought process behind educating people and introducing this new tradition about the Asian cultures and Asiatic holidays and celebrations?
Yeah, it started as the Chinese New Year concert, actually. So it was very kind of specifically targeted to the Chinese American community in New York. And we had a number of donors and board members who really wanted us to do some programming around that holiday for the Chinese community here in New York, which is significant. We were also engaged at that time, in some pretty strategic partnerships with the Shanghai Conservatory and the Shanghai Symphony to start the Shanghai Symphony Orchestra Academy, which took New York Philharmonic players to Shanghai 3 or 4 times a year to teach master classes and to really teach the art of orchestral playing. So Chinese New Year was started because we wanted to reach that community here in New York, and not, I would say, necessarily with the idea of, I'll be honest, not with the idea of sharing Chinese and East Asian culture with a white audience or with other communities in New York, but it has become that, and it has opened up over the years, and it has evolved, it embraces all cultures that celebrate Lunar New Year now, which I think is great. And because it has been such a fun and colorful and musically satisfying experience over the years, I guess it's almost 10 years now, I think we have done something to bring that culture into the forefront of New York musical life. So I'm happy that it's continued and that it continues to be successful.
I wanted to continue off of that train of thought and jump right into the article that you shared with us. I really hope everybody else in the course had a chance to read this article, Just Another Dumb Asian Singer, written by Nicholas Fan. I'm sorry if I didn't pronounce that correctly. I know that Tim and I and a multitude of other students in the course are extremely excited to get to speak to you, especially as like an Asian American musician myself. So just with the rest of the course and the discussions that we've been having in the past as a backdrop, I wanted to ask you specifically about especially like today with the fear of the social justice movements and COVID-19, racism, how to be anti-racist. Those are all at the forefront of the nation's attention right now. We have the Black Lives Matter movement, but also we have the Counter Blue Lives Matter movement. We also don't get to hear a whole lot about, I guess, like other similar groups or races, not to diminish from other, I guess, voices, but I was just wondering, what were your thoughts on the Asian position within the conversation today? And what do you see the role of Asians being in the discussion?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this so much, Sage, and there are a couple of things at play here. One is that there are a lot of Asian and Asian American players in major orchestras across the country, right? And so I think that there is an impression among the people who hold the power and the money in large cultural organizations that there is no Asian problem, right? That there is no racism, because look at all the Asian violinists that we have, right? And I think that that's where we get into trouble. It's like, you know, representation in orchestras we have, but there are many, many subtle forms that racism takes that should not be ignored just because we are represented in orchestras, right? So my friend Jennifer Ko, who's a very well-known Korean violinist, for example, the number of times that older European white male conductors have said to her, you know, wow, you really play with a lot of emotion. I'm so surprised. You know, the implication being that like she's Asian and she's a woman violinist, and so technically they're not surprised that she can, you know, play the socks off of anything that's put in front of her, but the emotion, you know, is like something that they're surprised that she can bring to the table. And it's like, by the way, I grew up in Chicago, and you know, I grew up in America, right? And then I think there's also, you know, it's really the invisibility issue for the Asian community. It's like, oh, they're the model minority, they're represented, like we don't need to worry about them. But there are lots of incidents, and you know, I'm not by any stretch of the imagination saying that the current situation with COVID and the labeling by our former president of COVID as the Asian, you know, the China virus and whatever. I'm not saying it's a horrible, terrible thing. And the attacks on Asians, and especially Asian elders, weirdly, right, in communities across the country, the violence, the threat of violence against people. It's not a good thing. It's a horrible thing. But at the same time, you know, in every crisis, there's an opportunity, right? And there's I feel like it's like the conversation is finally starting that that the Asian community, like our brothers and sisters in the Black community, in the Latinx community, in the Indigenous people community, in the LGBTQ plus community, in the differently abled community, et cetera, that we all have unique challenges and issues around otherness and racism that need to be talked about and addressed. And Sage, like you said, I really recoil from situations where we get into like, well, you know, we have more pain than you, and you know, like you don't have to endure this, and you know, whatever. But it's not about that. It's not about a competition to see who has more pain. It's actually about recognizing the things that we have in common that we need to overcome in this country, recognizing the differences and the uniqueness of each of our experiences, even within the Asian community, right? Never mind between the Asian community and the Black community and stuff. So what I feel about Nick's piece and about this time in our country for Asians is that it is a time when we have the opportunity to start the conversation and to have a place at the table about talking about otherness, along with all the other communities that need to talk about otherness, and to talk about the ways that we are privileged and the ways in which we are disadvantaged, and not to have, you know, our white allies assume things about each of our populations. It's like, oh, we don't need to worry about them. Let's focus on the Black thing. It's like, yes, Black Lives Matters is a real thing. And, you know, generally speaking, until recently, I didn't have to worry about walking down the street with Tim in New York and people crossing the street because they thought that we didn't look safe, which is what our Black brothers and sisters feel all the time. You know, I didn't have to worry about going into a store necessarily and having someone follow me around because they thought I was going to steal something, which is something that my friend Audra McDonald, who has won 6 Tony Awards, has had to happen to her, you know? So we all have our thing, and we need to be open about it, and we need to talk about it. And that's our opportunity right now, is to talk about it and not be silent anymore. You know, there was an article in the Times recently about an older Chinese woman in Flushing who got attacked. And what moved me the most about that article and pained me was that she didn't want any trouble. She didn't want to press charges. She didn't want to make a big deal out of it. She just wanted it to go away, and she wanted to go on living her own life. And I respect that as a generational thing, but this generation, more yours than mine, it's like, we can say the things, right? We can have the conversation. We can raise the issues. So that's the moment that we're in. And that's why I wanted to share Nick's article with all of you, because I think he very, very eloquently, articulately, and specifically points to the challenges that our community faces, even though, technically speaking, there are a lot of us in the classical music world.
I wanted to circle back to the stereotype that Asians are like robotic, machine-like, that we're all extremely mechanically talented, and people tend to be shocked, I guess, at emotional capability of professional Asian musicians. I was just curious, have these perpetuating stereotypes regarding Asian participation and lack of artistry, have they impacted your personal music journey at all?
You know, I'm not a performing artist. I mean, I still sing in a choir, and I sing tenor, so I'm highly sought after. But let me turn the question around, which is that something occurred to me recently, and I don't know if it's true or not, but I'm going to share something very personal with you all, which is that I've been fortunate and had the great opportunity to work for some great orchestras across the country. Right, I started my career at the Philadelphia Orchestra. I had my first senior position with the Cleveland Orchestra, which is an amazing orchestra. Just, they play like a dream. I was with the LA Philharmonic when Esa-Pekka Salonen was music director, and we opened Walt Disney Concert Hall. And I was at the New York Philharmonic with Ellen Gilbert. And I will tell you that in each of those situations, I felt challenged as a senior leader. And I wasn't quite sure why. And I'm still not quite sure why. I felt like I was always at odds with my boss, who was, in any situation was the president or the executive director of an orchestra, right? The person in charge of the whole thing. And then I was in charge of artistic planning and booking artists and, program planning and so on and so forth. And over the years, I just found myself with each boss that I had just being kind of in tension with them, I wanted to do it this way, but they wanted me to do it that way, and I chalk some of it up to my own growth as a professional, that there are ways to manage up and there are ways to get on the same page with your boss that I did not learn fast enough, maybe, or that I didn't, because I was very young when I had my first senior position with the Cleveland Orchestra. I just didn't know how to operate in a organizational culture where alliances need to be built and people need to be socialized, and you need to test your ideas out before you go do them, and all of the things that you all will learn as you go into the workplace about working with teams and with leaders and with bosses, and trying to get your vision and agenda across without pissing people off, right? But then something occurred to me very recently, and honestly, it's just a theory, and I don't know whether it's true or not. It's that I wondered suddenly, because in an interview, right, you're on your best behavior and you're trying to present your best self and you're being very positive and constructive all the time, et cetera, and then you get hired. And then I wonder how many of my bosses thought they were getting a good, respectful, authority, respecting, hierarchy, respecting Asian worker. And then I show up and I'm very opinionated and I talk a lot and I assert myself, maybe sometimes too much or maybe not enough. And they didn't, I wonder now looking back, how much of the dynamic was they didn't get what they thought they were going to get because they hired someone who looked like me and who in the interview was trying to get the job and, be, deferential and respectful. And then I arrive and I'm like, no, I don't want to do it that way. I want to do it this way, or I think this is a better idea, or whatever. So I think the truth is somewhere in between. Probably like I had some growing to do as a professional, but also I think that people saw me in a certain way and they perhaps didn't get what they bargained for. So that's a very, very subtle form of typecasting and of discrimination, I guess, because I certainly got opportunities, but something else happened recently, which is that before I landed at QXR, I was being interviewed to be the head of a fairly major orchestra, and I didn't get the job, and I was told by the chair of the board and the search committee that they loved me, they thought I had such great vision, and they thought that I could totally do the job, but that this other person who did get the job just had more experience. Like he had managed a bigger orchestra before, and so he was better suited. He was more of a sure thing. And I really felt at that moment, I have to say, like, okay, you're telling me I can do this job. You're telling me that I impressed you, but you're giving the job to this white older guy because he has more experience. And it's like, if I were doing hiring for a job on my team, if I had two people who I thought were going to do equally well, and one was a candidate of color, I don't believe in relaxing standards in the name of diversity, but I do believe, like, all things being equal, like right now is the time to elevate, diverse people into leadership roles. And so that really pissed me off, because I was like, okay, you want to go the safe way and like have someone who looks like every single person who's had this job before him do this, when you could have me, who you say I could do the job and do it well, but it's just like, I didn't want the job if they didn't think that I could do it, but they said they wanted, they thought that I could do it. And so, like, what's the deal? And then the most blatant form of racism, which is kind of funny now because it was fairly innocuous and it comes from that place of ignorance rather than malice. It's like, I was an intern for the Milwaukee Symphony early in my career. Anyone from Milwaukee? Lovely city, nothing against Milwaukee. But one of the board members, an older white woman, after I was introduced to the board as the intern, turned to me and said, well, we're so glad to have you with us, and your English is so good. Which I'm sure many of us have, gotten something like that before. And I couldn't help myself. I just turned to her and I said, thank you so much. It was the language of instruction at Harvard.
Yeah, that just all those stories you were telling. I mean, I've had a similar experience with work. I'm not going to call on anybody, but I've been through that. I had, like, from a student's perspective, where and I've had the stereotypes of, oh, we don't speak English. Oh, I was born in New York. Something like that. Or someone asked me, oh, do you play violin and piano? Like, actually, I do play piano, but I play oboe. But
Yeah.
I have to, like, show it's this barrier that you were talking about that we kind of have to get past. Yeah. And so I actually kind of did find it getting past it in music somehow, in a backward sort of way.
I mean, do you all know who Anthony McGill is? He's the principal clarinet of the New York Philharmonic. He's a fabulous player, great artist, right? And like the number of people who say to him, oh, do you play jazz? And he's like, I'm classically trained. I was principal clarinet of the Metropolitan Opera and the New York Philharmonic. No, I don't play jazz.
Yeah, but sometimes I've found like there's these things in music where it's most obvious sometimes, like say you're just talking about the robotic thing, and then there's the all Asians play violin and piano, but in the same way, you can also kind of break those barriers, I feel, in music in some ways. And I was wondering, how do you see like music being a way where we can kind of even things out and sort of in terms of equality, or just look at diversity, or even try and just remove these curtains that of racism, or perceptions and stereotypes.
That's a good question, Tim. Look, I do think that, and I will show my innate optimism here. I do believe that music, and especially the music that we all love and that we're involved in, has the power to bring people together, has the power to build community and to show commonality, right? So outside of the structures of, boards and executive leadership and auditions and so on and so forth, like the art form that we care about, especially if we continue to make sure that we embrace all voices. And I want to be very clear that I am not interested in canceling Beethoven, right? It's not either or. It's not like we play Florence Price and so we can't play Beethoven. It's both. It's like, I don't want to lose Beethoven. Beethoven's great. But Florence Price was overlooked for a very, very long time. And I just heard her piano concerto with the Philadelphia Orchestra online, and it's like, holy crap, this is an amazing piece, right? And I was responding to the music. And so people who care about music, people who make music, people who listen to music, ultimately, I believe there is the potential to come together, And so I think it pains me to see classical music going through this reckoning with itself about its systemic practices and the ways that we have fallen down in the past 300 years. But at the same time, music is so universal. It's a language that can really speak to anyone, like maybe not orchestral music and maybe not, Tchaikovsky particularly, but art and music is what brings people together. It's what builds communities. So like, let's lean into that and use that to get past some of these obstacles and some of these issues of otherness that I'm talking about.
I wanted to expand upon just the general discussion of Asian stereotypes. Something that was discussed in the article was the term tiger parenting, which I know
Mm.
almost everybody is very familiar with. It's just that stereotypical like style of Asian parenting where the parents are extremely like demanding of their children and force them to do all these things. And my mom actually owns that book that popularized the phrase. I think it's called Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother by Amy Chua. Very contentious. I remember reading it when I was literally in like middle school and thinking, is this what Asian parenting is supposed to be like? Am I not being raised Asian enough? And should I be grateful that my parents aren't this tiger, or should I be ashamed that I'm not being Asian enough as an Asian American? So I'd love to know your thoughts personally on this stereotype in particular. I know it's not super music focused, but I think there is definitely a lot of tie-ins with tiger parenting and musical Asian upbringing.
My personal theory, Sage, about that whole situation is that I think it's more of an immigrant thing than it is a particularly Asian thing. So my parents, like many, the 60s was a time of high Asian immigration because of the Immigration Act of the 1965, I think, or 64. And so there was a wave of immigrants, of Asian immigrants from Korea in particular coming to this country. And I think that I think there's something about transplanting your life to look for a better life that that is common to all immigrants, regardless of race, and that especially the immigrant generation, like my parents, they pushed me so hard because that's what they came here for, was to make sure that I would have a better life, that they would have that I would have more opportunities than they did back in Korea, right? And that they wanted to establish themselves. So I don't know. I would really love to do more reading about um, immigrants from other parts of the world and other ethnicities, when they really, like, when the first, like, what was it like for the Irish, in the late part of the 19th century, early part of the 20th century. What would, you know, a lot of people draw comparisons between the Asian population and the Jewish population that emigrated to this country, and a lot of the conversations about reverse quotas for Asian students now at Ivy League universities were the same things that Jews were facing in the 50s, right? So I think it's a thing about the US being a country of immigrants and of those immigrants wanting a better life for their children and pushing really hard to make sure that happens. I'm not sure that general unified theory actually holds up, consistently, but I don't think it's a racial thing. I think it's a social, socioeconomic, immigrant, whole confluence of things, I guess. But
Yeah,
yes, my mom pushed me really hard too. Like, I was definitely the kid who would bring home 98 on my math quiz, and her first question would be like, "Where are the other 2 points?"
Highly
And kind
relatable.
of, yeah. And kind of going off that, actually, there's this thing I've noticed actually where we have this idea of tiger parenting, but then applied to music directly. You see these kids, you would think, oh, they could become a great musician. They have talent, they have, this ability, they want to do the music, but then the parents push them so hard they burn out, right? They hate the music because they play it so much. They practice piano, I don't know, 6 hours a day, every day for 5 years on end, 6 years on end, and then they don't want to do it anymore. And so you're losing out on that talent. So what do you think about, how can we juxtapose those two and reconcile, this style of, parenting and upbringing versus, trying to encourage people to like music, because like you said, using music and art as this way to connect communities and bring people together and break differences is important. But then there's also the parents too, and this culture.
Yeah. I have a lot of musician friends who have had to do that reckoning. So, very well-known violin soloists, for example, Prodigy, like, was, made major orchestra debuts when she was preteen, et cetera, et cetera. And she had to stop for a while because she wasn't sure whether she was doing it because she wanted to do it or whether because it was what she had been trained to do, right? Um, and I think that's true of a lot of fields where you have to start very young, right? Like, I think probably athletes go through this, like tennis players or Olympic athletes at that level. It's like, the intensity of the training and the all consumingness of it kind of takes, and at a certain point, you're like, wait, am I doing this because I like it? Or am I doing this because this is what I've been doing and what I've been told that I'm good at, right? And I guess my advice on that, having seen a few friends go through this, is like, it's okay it's okay to have those feelings, and it's okay to take a step back in some way and say, you know what, I'm just going to take a little time off from this and sort of think this through and see if I miss it and see if I try something else, like how that feels. And so this particular friend actually stopped playing for a little while. I mean, she always played because she wanted to, keep her chops up, but she stopped concertizing for a few years and enrolled in a graduate program in a completely different field. And then she came back to playing because she realized she did want to do it and that it did make her happy. So I think it's a matter of, taking a moment at some point and saying, wait, and I, just a piece of advice to all of you who are just kind of starting on your musical lives, on your professional lives and whatever. It's like, take that time early, like, don't feel like you have to get on this track when you graduate from Cornell and then just shoot, straight in a straight line to where you think you want to be. It's like, it's much easier to take that break, whether it's a month or whether it's 6 months or it's a year, to take the time to evaluate, like, is this what I really want to do? Because you all are at an age where it's okay to try different things. Like, people expect that of people in their 20s, right? Like once you get into your like mid 30s and after, it's like if you start hopping around all the time at that point, like if you haven't kind of figured out what makes you happy by that point, people start to go, oh, like you spent a year doing this, and then you spent 2 years doing that, and then you spent a year doing that. It's like, that's okay in your 20s. Explore, like don't get so locked in right now, and try lots of different things, and make sure that the thing that you think that you want is the thing that you want, and not the thing that other people have told you you should want, right? So that's my advice.
Somewhat related to the topic, I wanted to raise a question left on our Canvas discussion post, if it's okay. Tony, are you here? I'd like to point out your question. If you're in the call, you're welcome to ask it yourself, maybe?
Oh, yeah, I'm here. So I was just wondering about like, because like some inequalities are like what are viewed, or like sometimes they're like self-imposed versus like, so I was just like asking like internal versus external factors of like, of course there are things that other people or other groups would do, but there's also things that like we do internally. So like one of the things that like was with me was like my parents would definitely not like be fans if I tried to like pursue music as a career, like anything outside of a hobby basically. So I was like wondering about your thoughts about that.
Right. So, Tony, I think yours was the question in the document where you said, well, how do you handle if like you do want to pursue like music professionally and your parents are not supportive? Is that sort of the gist of it?
In a way, well, just like how like some things are, like some inequalities are like imposed by like so if you talk about like representation in music would be like or like some things are like self-imposed. Like I'm like giving that as an example where like it's kind of like self-imposed in a way versus like external factors of other people not letting you in versus. So.
I'm sorry, I'm having a little trouble hearing you, and I'm not quite sure what the question is. Yeah,
I can read the question from the doc. Yeah. So I think he's asking about, so how do you, how do you address internal factors within the minority? So like almost like self-directed biases or stereotypes. It's like like an Asian thing. Everyone becomes a lawyer and a doctor, say, right?
Right.
And and if you want to go into a career in music, how do you reconcile these two differences, right? I think that's what his question.
Yeah, like we have this image that we impose on ourselves. So what like Sage was saying, like when she read about the Tiger Mom situation, she thought, well, am I a good enough Asian if I'm not like in this situation, right? I have to tell a quick funny story, actually, which just popped to mind as you were asking this question, is that there are these two Korean brothers who I can't quite remember their names at the moment, but one was a lawyer and one was a doctor, right? And in the Obama administration, one was actually named one of the assistant attorney generals in the administration, which is a fairly important job. And the other was named assistant surgeon general of the country, right? And when they got these nominations from Obama when he took office, and they called their mom to tell them about what was happening, she said, "Wait, why assistant?" Yeah, so there is this self-imposed thing that we do about what we should be and what we can be and what we can't be, and gosh, how do you overcome that? I actually don't play an orchestral instrument. I'm a choral singer, and I've always loved classical music, but I don't play the violin. So that's, that's another thing that's happened in my life. Of course, people are like, oh, do you play the violin? I'm like, no. But going into, and like the thing that we're talking about where, my parents expected me to go to law school or business school or to become a doctor or, something that they would recognize. And I remember the very first time I said, oh, I think orchestra management and arts administration might be something that I could do and that I would be good at. My mother literally broke down in tears at the thought and said, I would rather you be a janitor at a law firm than do that. Like, then I could say that you worked at a law firm. She's over that now. So yeah, people have to overcome a lot of cultural barriers to do what they want to do and be who they truly are. And how does one do that? I guess it starts with being honest with oneself, and taking the time to, as I said about career choices and things, it's like, take a step back and really, like, no one's going to hear you if you're honest with yourself. Like, you don't have to be afraid that people are going to judge you. Although we judge ourselves, but, just try to put yourself in a space where you can be really honest with yourself, at least as a start. And that doesn't mean that you're going to take that next step and, and do the thing that you honestly want to do. Maybe you're not ready for that yet, and it's okay. But I think you don't get anywhere unless you're honest with yourself, or surround yourself with people who will be honest to you as well, And again, that's diversity, right? Because, I'm going to go out on a limb here, and I'll say that I had a lot of Korean and Korean American friends at Harvard who only hung out with other Korean people, right? And I know that is comforting, and I know that is familiar, and I know that is empowering in many ways. And I'm not saying don't do that, but I am saying that I think that if my social family, my family of choice, were not as diverse as it has been over the years, that I'm not sure that I would have found my true self. Because if I had really only hung out with family and with other Korean Americans, I think I would have gotten a lot of reinforcement of the same stereotypes and self-imposed possibilities that I had internally as well, right? So having a diverse group of friends and a diverse cohort of colleagues and people that you make music with is so beautiful, because they come from a totally different place. And, if you were to say, well, I think I want, if I had said to, if I had known then, if I had said to my roommates in college, like, I think I want to be an orchestra manager, they'd be like, yeah, why not? Like, what's stopping you? Like, what's the problem? Well, I'm supposed to be a lawyer. It's like, they actually all ended up being lawyers, so maybe that's not a good example. But I think surrounding yourself with people who are going to challenge you and challenge your perspective on things is really what all of this is about, in the largest sense of the word.
Yeah, and that's what I've discovered is really great about Cornell. And when we went on tour with the orchestra to Taiwan, I remember a couple of years ago, I got to, hang out and make friends with people that I wouldn't have met, otherwise, say, or I wasn't going to talk to beforehand. And then, you get to see, when you're exploring another country, you're kind of just with the people you're there with, and then you get to, explore the culture and, get challenged with these different perspectives. And I wanted to kind of go off that sort of, but in terms of history, and we have a couple great questions that are related from Alex and Gus. And if you guys wanted to say something, you can raise your hand. But basically what they're asking is, when you learn in history, right, you learn it's a lot of, white-centric or Anglo-Saxon-centric or American-centric history. And you barely learn about Asian racism or events. Like, when I took history, the Chinese Exclusion Act was mentioned in passing, and that was it. And they built the Transcontinental Railroad, and that's it. So, most of the time it's not brought up. So how do we address that in education to expand people's?
Yeah. I think that I was having this conversation. I was moderating a panel for the Sphinx Conference, which, is very active in inclusion in the classical music field. And someone said, like, how do I affect change in my school? Like, I'm just a student. Like, how do I change? In this case, she was talking about, like, I wanted to play a Florence Price sonata for my class instead of a Beethoven sonata. And my teacher said, no, you have to play the Beethoven sonata, right? And so she was like, how do I change that dynamic of like, of Beethoven being the only thing that I'm going to be judged by, right? And the consensus seemed to be, you're not the only one who feels that way. And there's safety and there's power in coalition. And that, a thoughtful, a thoughtful and frankly, respectful request of a group of students with a petition to say, we would like to see more time devoted to these incidents and to these subject matters. And we would like to see our history in this country represented in the history of this country, I think is a very constructive and positive way to go. I think I saw as part of that question also, when I was in school and taking my American history class in the US, did I notice that, I wasn't really being represented? And I'll be honest with you, I didn't. I just kind of took what they gave me and I'm like, oh, this is American history. But that's what's amazing about right now. It's like people are talking about this and people are saying, no, like there are more stories to tell that aren't being told. And I think that if you meet with resistance and you have a professor or a high school teacher who's like, I'm going to teach what I teach, then I think it's okay to be peacefully protest and to say, I don't think this is right. I think we need to have a discussion, especially at private institutions of learning like Cornell and high schools and stuff. Also, one of my panelists at Sphinx said he went to his dean at Yale School of Music and basically was like, look, like I am all over your brochure. Like it's me from the front and it's me from the side and it's me from the back. So you can show that Yale is not all white. Like, and I'm okay with that. But that gives me the right at least to come to you and say, I need you to listen to me, right? So sometimes there is power also in, at this time in certain institutions of saying, like you need to listen to me because you need me to represent this institution as well. And you don't want me not representing the institution in a favorable light, do you?
Yeah, and it's important, I guess you're saying, to have that activism from these figureheads that can get the message across of this equality and demand, I guess you're saying.
Yeah. Did you all see on social media this whole thing that's happened at Oberlin over the past week? There was a poster, go on Instagram or just Google Oberlin Black History Month. And they had posted on social media, it's like, Oberlin celebrates Black History Month with the music of Florence Price and Chevalier Saint-Georges and William Grantstill and so on. And it pictured 6 instrumentalists who were going to be giving this recital, and they were all white. So it's like, celebrate Black History Month with like all of these white students, right? And it was just so tone deaf, and it was so, and they've apologized and pulled it back and whatever. And, I just have to think it's like, this is what I mean about elevating diverse voices to positions of responsibility and authority, because I have to think that if there were a Black person in a leadership position at the Oberlin Conservatory, and maybe there is, and I don't know about it, but I find it hard to imagine that if there were a Black dean or a Black, head of the senior member of the conservatory, that they wouldn't have said, like, are you kidding me? Like, you can't post that. And so when you have one perspective acting as the gatekeepers for an institution, that is a real problem. That's the whole point.
Yeah, and kind of going off of that, actually, this idea of you have these different leaders in different groups even, and so this kind of takes us back to the question that we had about different movements. And Aiden had a related question I wanted to ask too. You have these distinctions between, like, for example, you were just saying there's a Black leader versus, say, an Asian leader in the leadership board, but how can we, this term racism is very broad, and discrimination and stereotype. So how can we, are there commonalities between the two? And also, I've seen and read about how there have been accusations between groups when arguing, saying, oh, you're anti-Black, say, or oh, you're anti-Asian. But, I have a friend who does Asian activism, and she has a quote that says, you can be pro-Asian without being anti-Black, and vice versa.
100%.
And so how do you see this dialogue happening between different groups and, to get the progress in advancing the message, like you said?
I guess at the end of the day, it's about trying to find what you have in common with various people and with various groups, and using that to focus your efforts to kind of be pulling in the same direction, as opposed to focusing on, as I said before, trying to one up each other in terms of who's got it worse. And I do think that it's important to celebrate and to note differences of communities, but I think if we focus on what we have in common and what we're trying to get done together, that it'll help us overcome those kinds of tensions. And look, East Asian culture in particular is very homogeneous. Back in Asia, there are very few Black people in Korea, for example, and I think Korean culture is racist. I do, and I think we have to own that as Asian Americans also, and recognize that we have to move past that as well. So we have to, just because we are subject as Asian Americans to racism and discrimination doesn't mean that we are immune from that ourselves towards other people as well. And we have to recognize that also. I'm sorry, that's not really very helpful, but it's how I think about things.
Yeah, it's an interesting question on how to, because you have to walk this fine line of, you don't want to offend the other group. You want to make sure, tell them they're validated, but also you don't want to put down your own movement, say, and vice versa. You want to, there's all these equal, or they're different, but they might be equal points of view, in these different movements behind that.
This is actually constructive and specific, is that I belonged to a cohort of arts leaders over the past year through a program called National Arts Strategy. It's one of the most diverse cohorts that I've ever been part of. So it's people who run arts organizations, from jazz festivals to dance companies to art centers to community music schools to orchestras all over the country, racially incredibly diverse. And the thing about the group that I value the most, other than just having this national network of people, is that we were able to develop an implicit trust in this group of 40 people, because there was an incident basically during one of our sessions at Harvard Business School, and we all had to kind of process this incident together, where a professor basically said something that none of us reacted very well to, and we needed to process that. And as a group, we got ourselves to a place where we were able to trust that intentions were good, even if mistakes were made, and where mistakes were okay, so that people were not afraid to say things for fear of saying the wrong thing, and that they knew that they wouldn't be punished or excluded for saying something politically incorrect if the intention was to learn. And that it was also okay for people to say, you need to go do some work in that area. And it's not our job to educate you on that. You need to do some basic homework. So we respectfully say that you've got some catching up to do and you need to go do that. And that was okay too. And that was not meant to be disrespectful. And that was not meant to be diminishing. So I guess the question that I have is, if you're part of an orchestra like the one that you are part of at Cornell, or if you are part of an organization like the New York Philharmonic or the New York Public Radio and WQXR, like what can we do to create safe spaces for honest dialogue, right? Where good intention is assumed, where you're allowed to make mistakes and no one's going to think you're a terrible person for saying the wrong thing because they know that your intentions are good. And where people are allowed to like say, you know what, you need to go work on that before we can continue this conversation. So those are kind of the three things that are important to me in being in a cohort of people where I feel like I can be my authentic self and where I feel like I can say, hey, I don't get this. Like, you know, like, will you explain this to me? Or will you tell me at least like, yeah, there's stuff on that you can read, you need to go Google it, you know? So as, you know, Sage and Tim as leaders of this orchestra, and as you leave Cornell and go into other spaces where you're maybe not going to be in a leadership position at first, but you know, how do you take every situation that you enter and encourage that kind of safety in communication? And I think that is fundamental to bringing communities together and actually having honest dialogue and doing something constructive.
I wanted to ask a direct follow-up. I'm hearing from some of my peers about like personal anecdotes or anecdotes that they've heard from other of their like their friends where sorry, Christine, I don't mean to call you out, but your example of how your friend was attempting to raise awareness within their own organization about anti-Asian racism and things, and how they were getting flack for potentially pulling awareness away from the BLM movement and taking the focus away from something that is currently like occurring right now, and even within the orchestra, we're making attempts ourselves. I wanted to combine this, I guess, into a two-part question. The first part would be, what do you say in response to that when someone says, hey, like I don't know what they would say, but something along the lines of, don't take the focus away from the BLM movement because that's what needs to be spoken about right now. Like, what could you potentially say in response to that? And actually, I'll let you answer that first. I have a follow-up question to that as well, but
I guess my response to that would be, tell me how I can help. You know, like, how can I help? Because I think, and my other response to that would be, I don't think we should look at it as an either or situation. Like, I think we need to say yes, and yes, Black Lives Matter, and the pain that I'm feeling is important as well. So how do we make space? How do we create space together where we can, you know, talk about both of those things? And, you know, I used to belong to this kind of casual group of peers in New York where our feeling was like arts organizations were constantly fighting over pieces of the pie, you know? And so like we were constantly like, in terms of funding, in terms of attention, in terms of, you know, and the idea, you know, the dynamic of like, there's this pie and you keep cutting it into like smaller and smaller pieces, or saying like, your piece is bigger than mine or whatever, right? And like the motto of our group was like, don't keep trying to just cut the same size pie into smaller and smaller pieces. It's like, bake more pie, right? So I feel like my response to like, you're taking focus away from BLM is like, I care about BLM. I think it's really important, but how do we not assume that the amount of attention on these issues is finite and that we need to divide it into certain pieces? How do we create more bandwidth to talk about all of this is what my response would be.
I think my personal struggle related to that is the existence of the all lives matter counter argument as well.
Yeah,
Like
I don't like the
people,
all lives matter.
right?
I personally don't like the all lives matter thing, because it's like, yes, all lives matter. Like Black Lives Matter does not mean that other lives don't matter, you know? So I find all lives matter like a reaction to Black Lives Matter as opposed to a true call for social justice.
Yeah, fully agree. It's just walking that kind of what seems to be a fine line between saying all lives matter versus and like diminishing the current movement versus like saying, yes, your lives matter, but also so do mine. I don't know. It's kind of a complicated issue. Lindsay had a question on the Canvas discussion that is somewhat related to this. Do you want to go ahead and ask her a question if you're here, or I can?
I don't have it in front of me, so maybe you can just ask.
Yeah, sure. Let's see. Currently, we are seeing a rise in efforts, including within our own organization, to play and have more Black composer recognition, I guess, and awareness. And I'm really proud of of our organization to be making these steps. But Lindsay raised a question about how they have played very little Asian music in their orchestral career, and they know very little about the history of Asian American music in the US. So what are your personal thoughts about the role of Asian music in orchestras within the country?
Yeah, I just think there's a lot of really beautiful music by composers of Asian descent and who are Asian American. I think, Anthony Chung is an amazing composer who taught at University of Chicago. I think Chen Yi, who teaches at University of Kansas, is an amazing composer. I think Tendun is a combination of a great composer and a great showman, but especially some of his early works are incredible. Bright Sheng, like there is not a lack of Asian voice and composition, especially Du Yun won the Pulitzer Prize, for heaven's sakes, like 2 or 3 years ago. So if you are not hearing those voices in the repertoire that you're playing, then go to the people who are making those decisions and ask them why. And they may say, well, we're really focusing, on this right now. It's like, okay, can we, yes, and, it's like, let's like not, like if every program has 3 pieces on it, right? Instead of fighting over whether that one piece on the program is going to be by a Black composer or by an Asian composer or by a Latinx composer, it's like, why can't we take 2 spaces on the program to represent, more diverse composers, and then, Beethoven or Tchaikovsky can still have their spot on the program or whatever, because we love that music and it's worth playing. But, do we really need to play, a Glinka overture, the Florence Price piano concerto, and Tchaikovsky 6? Or could we play an overture by Chen Yi and the Florence Price piano concerto and Tchaikovsky 6? It's just a shift of perspective. How do you increase the pie? Yeah, it's about, I'm curious to see what's going to happen as we come out of this crazy year, because people are going to be so eager to get back to live performance, I think. And also, frankly, from a business perspective, ticket revenue for places like the New York Philharmonic and the Chicago Symphony and the Boston Symphony and so forth, like ticket revenue is like not going to play as huge a deal as it used to, right? So there was this pressure to sell out Carnegie Hall every time that you had a concert, because you had to make money to pay for the, Berlin Philharmonic to come over or whatever. I think people are focusing more on local artists because travel restrictions. I think that we're not going to have to sell as many tickets because capacity is going to be limited. And I think that tickets are going to be in high demand because those who want to are going to be really hungry for the live performance experience, right? So you used to have to sell 2,800 tickets to sell out David Geffen Hall at Lincoln Center for a New York Philharmonic concert for it to be a sellout. Well, now if you're only going to be selling 40% or 50% of the house now, that's significant in terms of like not feeling that marketing pressure to program greatest hits all the time because you have to fill 3,000 seats 3 or 4 times a week. So this is a great opportunity to bake more pie in terms of making space for less core repertoire. Because you don't have to sell as many tickets, so you don't have to like jam all those top 40 classical hits over and over again into the program. And so you can make space for lesser known composers that deserve to be played, and that's baking more pie.
We have a couple follow-up questions in the chat. Matthew asks, do you think ticket costs will rise?
Will they rise? I hope not. I actually think that if the New York Philharmonic were to say, well, we can only sell 50% of the house, so all the tickets are going to be double now so that we can sustain our business operations, I think there would be an uproar. I think they would have a PR nightmare on their hands because it's expensive as it is, as we all know. And right now we should be about serving our communities as orchestras and not, here's what I hope. I hope every orchestra at every level in this country will come out of this really thinking about how that orchestra serves its community more and worrying less about how well they play. And I know that's kind of a radical statement because we all want orchestras to sound great, but honestly, it's like, is it that important whether the New York Phil is better than the Chicago Symphony, is better than the Boston Symphony, is better than the Berlin, like this competitive thing in the major orchestra world? It's like, it's such a waste of energy and resources. It's like, you're all good, you're all great orchestras, like serve your communities. So I think really high ticket price, I can't predict, but I have a hard time thinking that arts organizations will get away with, like jacking up their ticket prices because of limited capacity. I think they're going to have to find their revenue in other ways, or they're going to have to reduce their cost structure in some ways.
So we are coming up at 6:07 right now. So I think we have a couple minutes before the end of our session. Does anybody else have any questions they wanted to ask? Feel free to unmute and ask or send in the chat.
And if no one else has one, I have one that I think would be a nice tie-in wrap up to the conversation. Anyone?
Sorry?
Oh, I just have a final wrap-up question if no one else has any. And I like to ask this in general to our speakers, and because you get all these different perspectives. And so how do you see the role of, besides you mentioned community, right? So how do you see classical music as a genre? And just from a perspective, our perspective as musicians, going forward to appeal to newer audiences, to people who might not go to, or afford a concert, ticket to the New York Philharmonic or the Met, where you have $300 tickets. That's why they have student programs and things like that. But how do you see these organizations doing outreach and making it seem appealing and continuing this tradition, I guess, but also evolving too?
Yeah, there are a lot of thoughts that I have about this. So ticket prices is one. I think ticket prices at legacy cultural organizations have gotten out of hand, and it's really prevented us from reaching a wider audience. I think that the ritual of concert going has gotten a little stultified. The ritual of showing up and being dressed up and having a drink in the lobby and then going to sit in your seat, and then all concerts are 2 hours long and they all start at 8 o'clock and the seats are kind of uncomfortable and like you don't have enough time in between. It's like, why do all orchestra concerts have to be 2 hours long with a 15-minute break, which is not long enough, by the way, to go to the bathroom and get a drink, right? So I think the whole ritual of concert going needs to be reimagined. And what that's going to take, honestly, is a conversation with the musicians and the union about changing the way that we think about time and money, right? So, I, for one, would love to go to a concert where I could, hear a half-hour piece, like take a dinner break and talk about the piece with my friends and like have something tasty to eat and like have a nice drink and get to the bathroom and then go back for like the second part of the concert, right? But right now, because of the union rules about, they get overtime if they, play past 10:15, then, you can't stretch it out that long. So I just think we need to kind of rethink the whole experience of going to a concert and experiencing music. I went to a concert at the Park Avenue Armory in New York where we were all lying down on the floor and we in the dark, kind of in the dark, and we had these noise canceling headphones on that they kind of all, every audience member got a like a Bose noise canceling headphone. And so like it was like being in a sensory deprivation thing. It was utterly quiet and it was dark and it was so peaceful. And then at a certain point you heard a ping that was broadcast into your headphone, and you took off your headphones, and like rolling down this track with the platform was Igor Levit playing the Diabelli variations, like slowly through this dark room. And we're all like on the floor, like sprawled out on cushions and stuff. And I was just like, that was a fucking great concert, and he's a great pianist. So I think, what was the question again?
It was how can classical music and the genre change? And that's a perfect example that you're saying. How can we change the genre?
You're changing the ritual. I'm going to come back to something that I said earlier, which is that I don't personally love the term classical music anymore. Like, it's music. And I talk about orchestral music. I talk about chamber music. I talk about electronic music. I talk about opera, which is, musical theater in a way. But I don't actually like the word classical music because I think that for me, that refers to the music of Haydn and Mozart in that era. And like the term classical music is so off-putting to people who aren't already in classical music. It's like, why are we punishing ourselves by like continuing to talk about classical music as opposed to just saying it's music, Like Duke Ellington famously said, there are two kinds of music. There's good music and there's bad music, So I think genres also are breaking down. And, when I think about someone like Bryce Dessner, who is the front man for the National, but is also like a very, very beautiful orchestral composer, and he lives in both worlds. And like, that's what music should be. And I think for all of you who continue to listen to music, play music, maybe make a life in music, it's like the more we can get rid of genres and just talk about music, the better the future for what we now call classical music will be.
I think that's
Thank you
the
so much.
perfect note to end on. Yeah.
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 So I
Thank
wanna
you so much.
Thank Ed for sharing his experiences, but also thank our student moderators, Tim and Sage, for leading a great set of discussion and pulling all of these separate ideas into a wonderful session. And so we're looking for more moderators for our future guests. So please let me know. The next session ours is set with Alyssa and Danielle hosting Urgent Kang, talking about Florence Price's music. But we have many guests coming through the rest of the semester, especially in phase 2. So if you're interested in being a moderator and really getting to know our guests intimately and working with them before they appear, please let us know. Ed, thank you so much. I resonated so many times. I was just dying to get into the conversation, but I promised our students that I'll talk less and let our speaker and let our student moderators speak. I know some of the students have to go. I'm going to put everybody on screen for our group photo. So everybody, please turn your videos on, and we'll take 3 pictures. And Ed will graciously stay on maybe 10 more minutes if you have more questions and want to engage with them. But after the group photo,
is there really someone in the orchestra named Richard Wagner?
Yes,
that's amazing. I love that.
Richard is a bass player. All right, so I'll take 3 pictures. Here we go. 1, 2, 3. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you all, and thank you for your wonderful questions. And it's great, enjoy getting back together as an orchestra.